They dragged the widow out at first light and tied her wrist-high to the saloon porch post, rope grinding bone while a hot iron hissed against cotton. When the crowd pressed close, the words "Cowboy's thief" were blackened into her dress, and a purple swell already climbed her cheek. She held her chin up because swallowing hurt worse, because feeding their laughter would only buy them more. And she watched the sheriff's brother pace with a grin he wore like a badge as he announced that justice needed witnesses. A silver whiskey cup rattled along the rail while men placed cruel bets about how long shame could keep a woman standing. She searched faces for mercy and found only a stable boy staring like he'd seen a fire start. He bolted toward the livery without looking back. The sheriff's brother ripped her wedding band from its thread and said the thief had taken more than cattle. She had taken a decent cowboy's future, so the town would take hers in return. She tasted blood, then fixed her eyes on the far road where the dust line would appear if the only man who might help ever came back. They called him Eli Drummond's kind of friend. Quiet, hard to scare, gone a week driving strays to Black Fork. They said he'd been robbed by this widow when she cooked and cleaned at his line camp, and they said he'd left town to hide the shame. Lies spread faster than frost. The rope cut deeper. She thought of the ledger she kept for washing and mending, the coins she never stole, the baby boots she folded and put away when the coughing took her husband in spring. She thought of the night a drunk big hat whispered that a favor to the mayor could forgive any debt, and how her no had turned every door cold. The crowd shifted as 3 riders pushed through, badges crooked, rifles bright, and the sheriff himself tipped his hat slow like a man blessing a grave he'd chosen. He told the people to step back while he read a charge no court had written, then lifted the iron again toward the burned words like a sermon. The stable boy burst from the alley, yelling that a mountain man was coming fast, that he'd seen a dust tail and a lean bay eating ground. Laughter snapped, and then fell silent. Hooves hammered. A bearded rider slid from the saddle before the horse had stopped and cut the rope in one clean stroke. Her weight dropped. He caught it with a forearm and a growl that sounded like a promise. No one moved. The sheriff's brother reached for his gun, and the rider's eyes found him, cold as creek stone. He said the town had made a mistake, and he'd be correcting it now, and the way he set his body told everyone the correction would draw blood if it had to. The widow's knees nearly buckled, but the mountain man's grip steadied her as if she weighed no more than the rifle on his back. Without asking her name or permission, he scooped her into his arms and stepped off the saloon porch, his boots thudding against the planks in a rhythm that silenced every whisper. The sheriff's brother barked something about interfering with justice, but the rider didn't slow. His voice was low and even, meant for her ears only, telling her she was safe now, and she wasn't going back. When he reached his horse, the crowd parted like prairie grass before a fire. He set her gently in the saddle, swung up behind her, and wrapped one arm around her middle, the other hand loose on the reins. The sheriff himself took one step forward, the kind of step a man makes before he tries to claim the last word, but the rider cut him off with a warning drawl. He said he'd been gone driving cattle for pay, and came back to find the town he'd once protected tying widows to posts. He told them the burned words were a lie, and anyone who believed otherwise could ride out after him, if they had the grit to face the truth. No one answered. As the horse moved, the widow tried to speak, but her throat was raw and the air burned going in. She only managed a whisper. Why? And he didn't hesitate. Said it was because a friend of his died trusting him to look out for her, and he wasn't about to break that promise over the drunken gossip of cowards. His arm tightened slightly, a reassurance that she wouldn't fall. The town's buildings began to blur behind them, replaced by open land and the long shadow of the mountains ahead. He rode hard until the saloon's shouting and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer faded entirely. Only then did he slow, letting the mare pick her way through a shallow creek that glittered in the sun. When they stopped by a grove of cottonwoods, he helped her down, his hands careful not to jar her bruises. He fetched a canteen from his saddlebag and held it for her, watching until she'd taken enough water to wet her throat. She asked again, "Why would you risk it?" And this time his answer was softer, almost like confession. "Because," he said, "they've been doing this to women too long, and I'm tired of burying the ones I'm too late to save." She looked up at him then, really seeing him for the first time. Weathered face, sharp eyes, and the kind of strength that carried more than just muscle. Somewhere far behind them, a single gunshot cracked the air. He glanced toward the sound, jaw tightening, and told her they wouldn't have much time before the riders came. The widow's breath hitched at his words, but before she could speak, the mountain man was already moving, checking the cinch on his saddle and scanning the ridgeline beyond the cottonwoods. His eyes narrowed, catching a shimmer of movement against the glare. Tiny flashes like sunlight on metal. He muttered under his breath that they'd saddled fast. She clutched the canteen as if it could anchor her in the moment, her mind racing back to the jeers and boots kicking dust in her face only an hour ago. Now the same men were coming, and she didn't even know the name of the one who'd pulled her away. He seemed to read the thought. "Name's Eli," he said, never taking his gaze off the horizon. He lifted her onto the horse again, swinging up behind her in one practiced motion, and turned the mare toward a gap in the hills. She felt the shift in his body as he leaned low, urging the horse faster, the pounding of hooves carrying them deeper into the wilderness. The sound of pursuit grew. Distant yells, the drumming of more than one set of hooves, the kind of sound that sets a body's pulse to match it. Eli didn't look back. His voice was calm but firm when he told her to hold on and not drop the blanket he'd wrapped around her shoulders. It wasn't just for warmth. As the land rose, the path narrowed to a rocky climb between boulders. The mare's breathing deepened, her muscles bunching and stretching as she found footing where no wagon could follow. Eli's plan was clear now, to take them somewhere the riders wouldn't dare or couldn't reach without slowing to a crawl. At the crest, he reined in and looked back. Sure enough, the men had split, half holding back at the base, half trying to find another way around. He swung down and offered her his hand, leading her off the trail into a cleft hidden by a tangle of scrub oak. The space beyond was small but deep enough to keep them hidden, and a trickle of water ran through it, whispering against the rocks. He crouched by the entrance, his rifle balanced across his knees, eyes tracking every shadow. She lowered herself to the ground, the blanket still tight around her, and felt the tremor in her hands as the silence stretched. Finally, she asked what they would do if the riders found them. Eli didn't look at her when he answered. He said they'd ride again, but if there was no choice. His voice dropped to a tone that made the hair on her neck stand. He'd make sure no one laid a hand on her twice. Somewhere below, the echo of a rider's whistle floated up the rocks, closer than before. Eli's grip on the rifle tightened. The whistle came again, sharper this time, and Eli's head tilted as if measuring the distance by sound alone. The widow clutched the blanket tighter, feeling the scorched letters beneath her fingers. Cowboy's thief. The burned words felt heavier than cloth, like they'd been carved into her skin. She whispered that they wouldn't stop, not until she was back hanging there for all to see. Eli's eyes flicked to her then, a brief study of the fear she was trying to swallow. "Not if I breathe," he muttered, then shifted his weight and moved forward to peer through the narrow gap in the rocks. Down below, 2 riders had dismounted, their horses restless as the men scanned the slopes. One pointed toward the ridge, The other laughed and spat in the dust. The widow's mind twisted at the sight. Faces she recognized from town, men who'd smiled at her once when she still wore a ring and carried baskets from the mercantile. That was before her husband's debt had chained her to gossip and ruin. She hadn't stolen anything, she told Eli in a rush, the words tumbling out. They said I took a silver watch from Tom Mather's saddlebag, but I never even touched it. He was the one who— Her voice broke, the rest falling into the dry air. Eli didn't ask for details, didn't question her truth. Instead, he glanced back at the mare tethered in the shadows and began cutting away branches from the scrub oak with his knife. He moved with a quiet efficiency, creating a narrow tunnel out the far side of the cleft. When she asked what he was doing, he told her they weren't going to wait for trouble to find them. They were going to make trouble lose them. The riders below started climbing, their boots striking loose stones. Eli slipped through the opening he'd made, pulling the mare after him, and gestured for her to follow without a sound. The path beyond was a thread of earth between jagged rocks, the kind that sliced at the knees if you stumbled. The widow's breath came fast, but she kept pace, her boots finding every foothold Eli used. When they reached a bend, he stopped and crouched, signaling her down. Through a gap in the stone, they watched the riders reach the cleft they'd just abandoned. One of them cursed loud enough to carry, the sound bouncing off the walls. They were only yards away, but already Eli was moving again, guiding her into the deeper maze of the hills. The sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long and thin, and with them came a chill that made the blanket's weight welcome again. Somewhere in the labyrinth of stone, the widow realized, the words burned into her dress would need to be answered. And Eli Carver, whoever he truly was, seemed like the man who meant to see it done. They moved in silence for what felt like hours, the widow's legs burning from the climb, her lungs tight from the thin air, and fear. Eli's stride never faltered, but every so often he would pause, crouch low, and touch the ground with his fingertips. She realized he was checking for signs, whether the riders had taken the same path. At one such stop, he frowned, brushing away a scatter of gravel to reveal the faint imprint of a boot heel. Fresh. Her stomach turned cold. Eli rose, his voice low enough that she barely heard him over the wind. They split up here. One's trying to get ahead of us. She clutched the blanket tighter, wishing it didn't still smell faintly of smoke and the sour sweat from when she'd been tied under the midday sun. They couldn't have known where they were headed, could they? But Eli's tone made her certain they had a good guess. The trail narrowed into a winding cut through boulders, the kind that seemed to funnel sound and shadow. She followed close, her boots scraping against stone, trying to place her feet where his had been. Suddenly, he stopped so abruptly she almost collided with him. Ahead, in the dust, lay something small and metallic, an old spur, dulled by age but dropped recently enough to leave a clean mark. Eli bent, turned it in his fingers, and gave her a look that told her it wasn't a coincidence. "We'll turn their trick back on them," he said, and without another word, he led her off the trail and up a steep incline toward a ridge where the wind flattened the scrub. She had to dig her hands into the dirt to follow, the rocks biting into her palms. But when she pulled herself over the crest, she saw why he'd chosen it. Below, the two riders were visible, one trudging through the very path they'd just abandoned, the other circling wide to cut them off. Eli crouched low, eyes narrowed, scanning the movements below. His hand went to the rifle slung across his back, not to raise it, but to rest there, like the mere fact of it steadied him. "You'll stay here till I'm done," he said, his voice flat but not unkind. And before she could ask what he meant, he was sliding down the far side of the ridge like a shadow. Alone on the ridge, The widow hugged the blanket to her chest, the letters Cowboy's thief pressing against her arms like a dare. Somewhere below, the men hunting her didn't know they'd just become the hunted. And for the first time since she'd been tied to that porch, her fear was threaded with something else. Anticipation. She lay flat against the ridge, the wind whipping strands of hair into her eyes as she watched Eli vanish between the rocks. For a long moment, all she could hear was her own heartbeat, and then, faint but distinct, the crunch of boots below. The rider, circling wide, had stopped, his horse tethered to a juniper as he scanned the slope. He didn't see her, but he was close enough she could make out the ugly twist of his mouth, the same man who had spit at her while she'd been tied to the saloon porch. Her fingers itched to grab a rock, to do something, but Eli's last words held her in place. The other rider appeared on the lower trail, leading his mount, muttering about how the mountain rat wouldn't get far. The two exchanged a glance and then separated again, one moving along the canyon floor, the other climbing toward the ridge. That's when Eli stepped out from the shadow of a boulder behind the climber. It happened so fast she almost missed it. One hand clamped over the man's mouth, the other wrenching his arm back until a knife clattered into the dirt. Eli shoved him down hard, kicking the weapon aside. The man landed face first, groaning, before Eli dragged him into the shelter of the rocks, out of sight. The second rider must have sensed something was wrong, because he swung into his saddle and started up the narrow incline at a reckless pace. That was when Eli looked up at her, pointed towards the ground at his side, and mouthed, "Now." She didn't think, just moved, scrambling down the slope until her boots hit the trail. The rider saw her and grinned, thinking she was running scared. He urged his horse faster. At the last moment, she stepped to the side. The horse thundered past her, straight toward the bend where Eli waited with a length of rope pulled taut between two boulders. The animal reared, the rider thrown clear, hitting the ground with a sickening thud. Eli was on him before the dust settled, yanking him up by the collar. "Tie his hands," Eli said, tossing her a strip of rawhide. Her hands shook as she bound the man's wrists, the bitter satisfaction of the moment burning hotter than her fear. When both men were secured, Eli took the blanket from her and draped it over her shoulders, not as a disguise, but as a statement. "We're not running anymore," he said. "From now on, we choose where this ends." She realized then that the hunt had turned, and she wasn't just someone to be saved anymore. She was part of the fight. They left the two bound men hidden in a shallow rock hollow, gagged and tied so tight the cords bit into their wrists. Eli didn't speak as they moved deeper into the canyon, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every rise and shadow. She clutched the blanket around her like armor, feeling the weight of his earlier words. They were no longer running. That truth both steadied and unsettled her. As the canyon narrowed, the air cooled, the stone walls casting them in shade. Eli slowed, crouching to study the ground. 3 sets of fresh boot tracks cut across the sandy floor. Not the 2 they'd caught. These were heavier, spaced wider, men moving with purpose. Whoever they belonged to, they were coming from the direction Eli wanted to go. "We'll circle," he murmured, angling up a steep, loose slope toward a ledge. She followed, her breath quick and shallow, hands gripping the rock until her fingers throbbed. Halfway up, a sharp whistle echoed through the canyon, followed by a faint answering call. Eli froze. The whistle wasn't meant for them. It was a signal between hunters. From their vantage point on the ledge, they saw him. A tall figure on horseback emerging from the shadow of a cliff face. His coat was black, his hat pulled low, and a rifle rested across his saddle. He didn't ride like a man searching. He rode like a man certain of where his quarry was. "That's him," Eli said under his breath, and she didn't need to ask who. The one who'd ordered her tied to the saloon porch, the one whose voice she'd never forget, mocking her in front of strangers. The man's horse stopped, ears flicking, and the rider lifted his head. His gaze swept the ridge, lingering on their ledge long enough to make her heart pound. She ducked back, but Eli didn't move. Instead, he watched, still as stone, until the rider's attention shifted to the trail ahead. Then Eli whispered, "He's alone now, but he won't be for long." They waited until the rider disappeared behind a curve. Then Eli slid down the far side of the ledge into a narrow draw. She followed, boots skidding in loose shale, until they reached a patch of dry grass, where a thin trail of smoke curled into the air. The smell of it hit her first. Burnt wood and something else. When they crept close enough to see, her stomach clenched. In the fire pit lay a dress, half burned, the scorched fabric still showing faint letters where the flames hadn't yet eaten them. "Cowboy's thief." "He's sending a message," Eli said grimly, and his eyes met hers with a resolve that felt like steel. "We're going to send one back." Eli didn't waste another breath. He stepped into the clearing, boot crunch loud enough to announce himself, and kicked dirt over the flames before the dress was entirely gone. The man who had been tending the fire spun around, eyes wide, one hand going for the pistol at his hip. Eli was faster. His Winchester was already aimed center chest. "Don't," Eli said, voice low but carrying the weight of someone who meant it. The man froze, his gaze flicking from Eli to her as she stepped into view. A slow smirk crawled over his face, the kind that made her skin prickle. "Thought I'd be seeing you again," he drawled, as if he were welcoming an old friend instead of someone he'd tried to ruin. Eli's voice was ice. "You're going to tell me where he is." The smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of calculation, but before the man could answer, hoofbeats echoed from the canyon mouth. Eli shoved the man forward and motioned for her to move. They slipped into the scrub at the edge of the clearing just as two riders appeared, both armed, both scanning the rocks like hunting dogs. The man by the fire called out, "She's close!" Eli's rifle butt hit the side of his head before the words had fully left his mouth. The man crumpled, and Eli didn't hesitate. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her toward a narrow split in the rock. They ducked inside, pressed against the stone, as the other riders dismounted and began searching the camp. From their hiding place, she could see the riders pick through the ashes, one of them holding up the burned scrap of her dress with a laugh. Their voices carried in the still canyon air, talk of bait, of how the boss would like to finish what he started in front of everyone. Her nails bit into her palms, rage and fear burning hot in her chest. Eli leaned close, his breath steady against her ear. "We take the horses. They'll be looking for us on foot." Before she could question how, he was already moving, slipping out the opposite side of the crevice. She followed, keeping low, every heartbeat loud in her ears. The horses were tied loosely to a mesquite tree, tails swishing lazily. Eli handed her one set of reins and swung onto the other. They rode hard and silent until the canyon walls fell away into open country, the wind cutting sharp against their faces. Only when they were miles from the smoke did Eli speak again. "This ends soon," he said, eyes on the horizon. "But not before I put him on his knees." By dusk, they reached the edge of town, the setting sun casting long shadows across the main street. She hadn't been back here since the day they'd tied her to the saloon porch and branded her dress with the words meant to kill her reputation. Every creak of the wagon wheels and distant murmur of voices made her heart slam harder. Eli dismounted first, scanning the boardwalks like a predator who'd found his trail. The street was quieter than usual, but a few faces turned, whispers carrying through the still air. Some of them remembered. Some had been there. Eli tied his horse to the hitching post in front of the saloon, then walked straight to the porch. The wood still bore the faint scorch marks where her rope had rubbed against the beam. She hesitated at the edge of the boardwalk, the memory pulling at her like cold hands. Eli's voice cut through. "This time, you're not alone." She took the step up, and the door swung open. The man inside, the one who'd ordered her humiliation, froze with a glass halfway to his mouth. His eyes darted from her to Eli, then to the rifle in Eli's hand. "You've got no business here," he said, trying to sound bored, but his knuckles whitened around the glass. Eli stepped closer, the floorboards groaning under his boots. "I've got all the business I need. You slandered her. You marked her for life. Now you're going to clear her name, right here, in front of everyone." The man laughed, but it was thin, strained. "And if I don't?" Eli's gaze didn't waver. "Then you'll leave this porch the same way you left her, except I'll make sure you can't walk away." Silence swallowed the saloon. A few men shifted uncomfortably, one slipping toward the door as if he wanted no part of what was coming. The saloon owner's eyes flicked to the street, where people were gathering, drawn by the tension they could feel from yards away. His voice cracked. "Fine. I'll tell them. She's no thief. She never was." The words fell like stones, heavy but not enough. Eli's jaw tightened. Louder, the man's face flushed, and he stepped outside. With the crowd staring, he shouted the truth, each word carrying the weight of his own fear. When it was done, Eli didn't move until he saw the shift in the crowd, the disbelief giving way to shame, and in some, to regret. Only then did he lower the rifle. "Come on," he said to her, his voice softer now. "We're not done yet. The real justice is waiting." They walked away from the saloon slowly, the sound of boots and murmurs fading behind them, but she felt every pair of eyes still burning into her back. Eli kept close, his presence steady, the faint scent of leather and dust grounding her. When they reached the livery where his horse was tied, she stopped and turned to him. "You think they'll forget?" she asked quietly. Eli shook his head. "They won't, but they'll remember something else now, that you weren't afraid to come back, and you weren't alone." He helped her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, his arms braced on either side. They rode through town at a slow pace, the people who had once turned away from her now parting to let them pass. A few tipped their hats. One older woman pressed a hand to her mouth, eyes wet. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was something. Once they were clear of the main street, Eli guided the horse toward the ridge where the wind carried the smell of pine and freedom. She leaned against him, the tension of the day finally giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. When they reached a clearing overlooking the valley, Eli dismounted and offered his hand. She slid down, her skirts brushing the grass, and stood beside him, the mountains glowing red in the last light of day. "This is yours now," he said, sweeping a hand toward the land below. "I traded 2 winters' worth of pelts for it, built a cabin that still needs a roof, and it's far enough that no one from that town can touch you again." Her eyes stung, not from the wind, but from the sudden flood of safety she felt in his words. She tried to speak, but Eli reached into his coat and pulled something out, a folded square of cloth. It was her mother's handkerchief, embroidered with her initials, the one she thought had been lost that day at the saloon. "Found it in the ashes," he said. "Figured you'd want it back." Her fingers closed around it, and something inside her that had been locked tight for years finally eased. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Behind them, the wolves began to howl, distant but not threatening. It felt like a chorus marking the end of something dark. Eli stepped closer, his voice low. You're safe now." And for the first time in a long while, she believed it.